Today's video partner is NordVPN. Now, if there's one thing that's certain, it's that we live in an uncertain world. I bet you're thinking that free internet at the cafe is a deal, right? Totally safe, right? Think again. Being on the internet means that you are a target for scammers, malvertising, phishing, password attacks, malware, ransomware. My God, the list just goes on and on. Remember that the next time you get that weird-looking email, unusual text, or you've been just notified that you've won a free fill in the blank. Hackers have only increased their skills and creativity when it comes to stealing your data, and they won't hold back. So why should you let them? Network security needs to be on the top of your list, and that's where NordVPN can mean the difference between surfing the net like a pro or having yourself a really bad cyber day. Right now, they're offering an awesome deal. If you purchase their 2-year plan, you'll get an additional 4 months free if you use my link, nordvpn.com/FPhistory. NordVPN keeps your digital location safe, but it also helps against web trackers, malicious ads, sus websites, infected files, and in general, it keeps your information your own. And check this out, they even offer a 30-day money-back guarantee. So do yourself and my channel a favor, hit that link in the description of the video. Again, nordvpn.com/FPhistory. And remember, you get 4 additional months free if you sign up for a 2-year plan. Folks, it's so important to stay safe. That is, cyber safe. So don't forget to hit the link below and let NordVPN help keep the bad stuff at a distance. It was nearing the end of the sailing season in March of 1508. By now, temperatures had risen dramatically and the humidity had become intense. It wouldn't be long before the monsoons would come and shut down all seagoing commerce. It was in the harbor of the city of Chaul that the ships of Cochin were being loaded with cargo. Their hope was to beat the weather and get in one last trading run. Lourenço de Almeida, the son of the viceroy, was there to provide protection for the cargo ships. The man had been demoted and assigned to basic convoy duty for over a year by his own father. This was punishment for his prior failure in 1506 to protect Portuguese allies at the city of Dobol. Lourenço was now in command of 3 small carracks, 3 caravels, and 2 galleys, crewed by approximately 500 men, which at this point was, well, a relatively small Portuguese fleet. Now, prior to his arrival at Chaul, the young Almeida and his men, in the spirit of holy war, had raided enemy ships along the coast, plundering as they went. The viceroy's son had waged a savage campaign to prove to his father that he was truly worthy of his name. But more than title or riches, Lourenço wanted redemption. Now, it has to be said that the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean had been disruptive, to say the least. Make no mistake, there would be consequences to those actions. Many cities remained hostile, and there were even rumors of a vast Muslim fleet that had arrived. But no one in the Portuguese high command could confirm this. Indeed, even Francisco de Almeida, the viceroy himself, had disregarded the reports of this fleet as nothing more than a story. As a result, Lourenço and his crews were essentially idle on board. Many were simply spending their money on wine and other indulgences that the city of Chaul could provide. They had nothing to do but wait for their merchantmen to fill their ships with spice and then escort them back to the city of Cochin. The mood was calm, and thus Lourenço's ships were positioned lazily in the middle of the Candalica River. However, that said, it was about midday towards the end of March when a series of ships appeared on the horizon. Even to the casual observer, one could tell they were moving in fast under full sail. But the ships were not Arabian or Indian in design, rather they appeared to be European, thus any sense of alarm was put aside. Some of the sailors even began to yell out in joy. They figured this was yet another fleet from Portugal. I mean, after all, Afonso de Albuquerque and his ships were actually scheduled around that time to meet them. But still, something seemed off. Why were they moving in so quickly? One judicious pilot, using a telescope, noted that the rigging on these ships was very different than what they were used to. And then, the dawning realization hit him. This inbound fleet didn't have red crosses on their sails. They had crescents. Far from being a Portuguese fleet, this was the vanguard of the fabled, disregarded Muslim armada. Panic and terror spread through Lourenço's ships like wildfire as men sounded alarms, raced to ready cannons, and adorned themselves with armor. Then, suddenly, behind the vanguard, even more ships appeared, too many to easily count. As the two fleets closed in and prepared for battle, it became clear to Almeida and his men that the Portuguese presence in the Indian Ocean was now going to be seriously contested. Jihad had arrived. Now, halfway around the world, the Republic of Venice was in a state of crisis. The lifeblood of its monopoly on spice was being drained away. Vasco da Gama's discovery of the sea passage to India had opened up a brand new way to bring in the extremely lucrative commodity. At first, the Venetians bet on the idea that the long route to India would prove either too dangerous or too impractical. But Portuguese determination proved them wrong. Year after year, the spice fleets came back again and again and again. The money that this brought in was beyond insane, and in record time, Lisbon became the new Venice. To their credit, for the first couple of years, the Republic of Venice tried diplomacy. Let's make a deal. Perhaps we could, split the money. Yeah, that would miserably fail. So they decided to recall their ambassador and send in the spies. One agent in particular would give both a concerning report and a subtle hint to his masters back in Venice on what to do. Quote, "I see that this enterprise in India cannot be destroyed by the inability to sail there. It goes on as a regular and stable business, and without doubt the King of Portugal will dominate the sea completely, because it's patiently obvious that the Indians cannot protect their maritime trade, nor resist the shipping or artillery of this most serene king. There is no doubt that the ships of India are weak for no other reason than the lack of cannons." End quote. By 1505, the situation for the Venetians had gone from bad to horrific. Portugal was not just cornering the market on spice, but doubling down on its Indian empire. In response, the Republic tried to lower its prices and thus beat the Iberian Kingdom in a trade war. That didn't work either. They couldn't lower their prices enough. They then turned to the Mamluks in Egypt. They tried to convince them to lower their import taxes, but the Egyptian Sultanate basically subsisted almost parasitically on its tariffs. Yup, another fail. Now, there was even an instance in order to facilitate trade that the leader of Venice, the Doge, Leonardo Loredan, proposed to the Sultan to build a canal to connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea at a narrow point, perhaps at the port of Suez. The Sultan, however, found the idea not to his liking. The cost would be enormous, the manpower needed ridiculous. And besides, what on earth would you even call such a waterway? The Canal of Suez? Absolutely preposterous. Completely exasperated, the Republic of Venice decided it was now time to play dirty. The Portuguese had committed numerous atrocities on the Muslims of the Indian Ocean. After all, ships had been raided, towns had been burned to the ground, and holy war had been conducted. But all of this paled in comparison to the absolute brutality that was seen with the destruction of the Muslim pilgrim ship, the Miri, whose barbaric and violent end still shocked all that heard the tale, and gave rise to the very legitimate concern that Mecca itself was in danger. As can be imagined, there was a lot of resentment, and the Venetians, well, they were going to simply capitalize on this. The Doge and his high council now pushed diplomatically to get the Egyptian Sultanate to act. They pointed out that the Mamluks, who had jurisdiction over Mecca and Medina, were truly defenders of the faith. With the Portuguese expanding over the Indian Ocean like a plague, the pilgrimage, the Hajj itself, was at stake. Something had to be done. But the Mamluks were not a maritime power, but that was not going to be a problem because Venice was determined to make them one. Advisors and engineers laden down with European ship schematics were deployed to the port of Suez, which was built into an impressive shipyard. Sailors were trained to man the ships, and more importantly, to fire Venetian-style cannons, which did have the capacity to bring down other European ships. Even raw materials would be taken care of. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors gives the tale, quote, "It became obvious that materials for both ship and cannon construction were being assembled for a concerted campaign. King Manuel received warning of this via the island of Rhodes, where one of the knights of St. John, a Portuguese by the name of André do Amaral, fed information on the Mamluks back to Lisbon. The Portuguese would later claim that the ships in the dockyards of Suez were being built with timber that was cut, dressed, and supplied by the Venetians. To make matters worse, their construction was overseen by Venetian officials. However, when the Portuguese ambassador at the English court of Henry VIII put such charges against his Venetian opposite in the summer of 1517, these accusations were flatly denied." End quote. By the winter of 1505, 6 European carracks and 6 galleys had been built. And keep in mind, all of them were carrying some of the finest cannons that could be produced. Then, 1,100 of the Sultan's men boarded the ships, and with several more support vessels, the Mamluk armada began its voyage down the Red Sea. Now, meanwhile, on the other end of the Mediterranean, King Manuel had lost faith in his viceroy. His advisors and members of the high nobility had convinced him that Francisco de Almeida was no longer a man to be trusted. The king's opinion of Almeida had thus shifted from mistrust to outright contempt. It was only a few months after the Mamluk armada had departed from the port of Suez that the Portuguese king had appointed Almeida's replacement. Alfonso de Albuquerque was given the title governor and was instructed to take over in India. A fleet had been prepared, consisting of 15 ships, which departed from Portugal on April 5, 1506. However, the governor had to share it with his co-commander, Diogo da Cunha, who was technically supposed to be in charge. The two men hated one another right from the start. Alfonso, who was convinced of the supremacy of his own abilities, disdained the idea of having to report to anyone. Their mutual contempt only intensified as they made their way first through the Atlantic, then around the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually along the East African coast. The fleet took its time. It looted and raided as it went. What's more, Cunha took it upon himself to explore Madagascar. Thus, it took them 16 months to arrive at their first objective, the island of Socotra at the entrance of the Red Sea. Here in late August of 1507, the Muslim garrison was stormed, and the island was taken after a brutal campaign of extermination. Socotra was to be the location of the next Portuguese base, with the intent to blockade Arabian commerce coming in from the Red Sea. However, it would turn out to be a disaster, as the island could not support its Portuguese garrison, and 4 years later, it had to be abandoned. Regardless, at this point, Albuquerque and Cunha had had enough of each other. Taking the best ships and equipment, Tristão decided to sail off to India. Albuquerque, meanwhile, decided to disregard his orders to block off the Red Sea. Instead, he took the remaining 6 ships and sailed along the southern coast of Arabia towards the Persian Gulf. His plan was to destroy all resistance. Roger Crowley gives us the account of how this campaign went down. Quote, "It was here in a few short weeks on the southeast coast of Arabia that Albuquerque founded a reputation that was exceptional within the ranks of the Portuguese conquistadors, and that would be cemented in its history as he gained the singular title, the Terrible." One after another, his fleet of tattered ships sailed into the trading ports of Oman. Some of the ports along the Omani coast decided to submit meekly, others resisted and were sacked. Albuquerque would use terror as a weapon of war intended to soften up resistance. In this fashion, a string of small ports went up in flames. The destruction of Muscat, which was a major trading hub along the coast, was especially savage. Albuquerque was intent on transmitting terror ahead of him. He ordered the ears and noses of the captured Muslims to be cut off, and then sent them to Ormuz as a testament to their disgrace. End quote. In this way, cities from Muscat to Khor Fakkan were either sacked or taken, but the real prize was the city of Ormuz. Ormuz was a major trading hub of spice and also happened to control the entrance to the Persian Gulf. It was a fabulously wealthy city that had even been visited by the famous Chinese treasure ships of the Ming Dynasty. Afonso arrived with his ragged fleet on September 25, 1507. He made a poor first impression. That said, 2 days later he crushed a large contingent of Muslim ships in the harbor. The vizier of the city sued for peace and agreed to pay tribute. Afonso was not satisfied. He insisted on the construction of a fortress. But by now, his men's anger at his harsh methods had reached a boiling point. 4 of his captains mutinied and departed with their ships. When the Portuguese governor heard of this, he flew into a rage. He ordered all the wells to be poisoned, the city bombarded, and every man, woman, and child to be executed. But these orders were too barbaric for even his own men to follow. Facing a full-on mutiny and a major native uprising in Ormuz, Afonso de Albuquerque was forced to retreat in January of 1508, but make no mistake, he'd be back for his prize. However, as he was gaining the title of the Terrible in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea was left wide open. Amir Hussein al-Kurdi was the admiral of the Mamluk armada. After departing the port of Suez at the end of 1505, he made his way slowly through the Red Sea. The man did have many objectives. His first destination was Jeddah, which controlled the sea approaches to Mecca. Here, Amir Hussein took his time to reinforce the city, improve its defenses, and assemble a garrison. Jeddah was to be a fortress. If the Portuguese were to arrive, the admiral was determined that they would face a challenge. But Mecca was still not secure. Arabia was in turmoil. Many of the Bedouin tribes at this point had risen up in revolt. Hussein marched his forces into the unforgiving sands of the Arabian Peninsula, systematically crushing this revolt, which took nearly a year. The Bedouin, after all, were a fierce adversary. They would exact a high toll in terms of casualties. Undaunted, the admiral pushed on and arrived at the city of Aden in August of 1507, just about the same time that Albuquerque was sacking the Omani coast. Now, during his time in the Red Sea, he consistently got reports of Portuguese atrocities in the Indian Ocean. He knew it was now time to bring the fight to them. Departing Aden, Amir Hussein made his way to the city of Diu. He found it rather strange that the vaunted Portuguese navy was nowhere to be seen. It was in September of 1507 when he arrived in India. At Diu, he would harbor his ships where they would undergo refit and repair. Here, Amir awaited for the opportunity to strike, and 6 months later, he got word that the viceroy's son was at Chaul with a meager force. The Mamluk ships were readied for battle. Amir Hussein even convinced the governor of the city of Diu, Malik Ayaz, to join him with the city's navy. Thus, the combined fleet, consisting of both the Mamluk armada and the ships of Diu, made their way to confront the son of the viceroy. The Mamluk fleet had managed to enter the harbor of Chaul. Amir Hussein had placed his European-style ships at the front of his formation to gain the element of surprise. It had worked. His vanguard had closed the distance to bring their cannons to bear. Meanwhile, the Portuguese were still scrambling to make their ships worthy of battle. Hussein sailed past the helpless merchant ships of Cochin as his target came into sight. His plan was to tactically decapitate his opponent by destroying Lourenço's flagship, the São Miguel, which was dangerously anchored midstream with only the São Antonio nearby for support. The lead Muslim ships opened up on the 2 vessels. Several of the cannonballs missed their mark, but 2 smashed into the hull of the São Miguel, blasting a hole right through. The rest of the Mamluk ships moved in to close rank. Turkish archers came to the main deck and began firing their arrows, that a chronicler would later recall seemed to fall like rain. On board Lourenço's flagship, 30 men out of a crew of approximately 100 were hit. Blood began to bathe the Portuguese decks, but by then, Lourenço and his men were ready to fight back. Crossbowmen ran to take cover and unleashed a salvo of bolts. They were quickly reinforced by sailors armed with guns. Then suddenly, the air was shattered by explosions. Crowley gives the account, quote, "The Portuguese gunners now had sufficient time to prime their cannons and loose off their own counterblast. In the shattering roar of the guns, both Portuguese ships vanished in the gun smoke and reappeared. 8 shots from the São Miguel hit the lead Muslim ship, which was crowded with 400 fighting men. The cannonballs ripped through the closely packed ranks, shattering armor, dismembering bodies. Splinters of wooden shrapnel only increased the carnage. The deck was a scene of chaos, and it was at this point that Hussein changed his mind about attempting to board his opponent. End quote. Amir Hussein altered his course to move beyond the São Miguel. As he scanned the scene, he saw the rest of the Portuguese ships coming in to assist. The 2 fleets then formed into battle lines, and for the next several hours they fired back and forth into one another. Eventually, both sides were exhausted, but it was only when the sun set that the fighting ground to a halt. The Mamluks, who had taken horrendous losses and were now low on gunpowder, retreated to one bank of the river. The Portuguese, who had also been bloodied, retreated to the other bank. The 2 opponents were now separated by a mere 1,500 feet of water. The ships of the EU, however, had not entered the fight. The governor, Malik Ayaz, kept his fleet back at the mouth of the river. Malik was a shrewd man, some would argue a bit underhanded. He wanted to see how things played out before deciding which side to back up. And for him, this first day was a draw. The next day, as the sun arose, Lourenço saw that the Mamluks had positioned their vessels side by side with the front of their ships pointing into the river. What's more, they had been chained together, and gangplanks had been put down so that men and equipment could be moved back and forth between the ships. Seeing this, Lourenço de Almeida could not believe how foolish his opponent was. It was obvious that the Muslims now had European ships, but it was also obvious that they had no idea how to properly use them. By adopting this formation, Amir Hussein had negated his ability to move, to maneuver, or even to bring his broadsides to bear. He had thus lost the initiative and made himself the perfect target. Lourenço immediately convened with his men. There were really 2 options that they could use. The first option was to bombard the Mamluks from a distance, something that the Portuguese were really good at. And the fact that their opponent wasn't really moving, well, they could probably do this blindfolded. Option 2 was to move in and take the enemy ships by direct assault, that is, to board and capture them, by far the much riskier venture. Lourenço gave it considerable thought, but he was a man who was still haunted by his failure at the city of Dabul. If he was able to capture those ships and bring them back as trophies, it would bring him not only glory, but perhaps the redemption he so eagerly desired. In the end, Lourenço wanted nothing more than to prove to his father that he was indeed courageous and worthy of his family name. Option 2, it would be. Lourenço de Almeida decided to strike at Amir Hussein's flagship. The plan was for them to pull up alongside, grapple the enemy ship, and board it. The rest of the Portuguese ships would come in to provide support and suppress the remainder of the Muslim fleet. It wasn't until the early afternoon that the winds were favorable, but on the incoming breeze, Lourenço and his men launched themselves into the attack. The Mamluk fleet had taller ships, so using that advantage, they immediately opened up with a deadly attack of arrows and cannon fire. Despite taking damage, the Portuguese kept their guns silent as they moved in to seize Hussein's fleet. But then, as they came within 30 feet, the wind died, and Lourenço and his men were at the mercy of the river current. When Amir Hussein saw what his opponent was up to, he masterfully ordered his men to give slack to the forward anchor lines and tighten the aft anchor lines. This effectively drew his ships back toward the riverbank and out of range for the Portuguese to grapple them. The São Miguel and her sister ship began to drift past their objective. They both dropped their anchors to maintain their position, but this made them easy stationary targets for the Mamluks. Lourenço and his men knew that they had failed in their attack. They suggested to their commander to open up with their cannons and obliterate the Muslims at point-blank range. Once again, Lourenço wanted a prize to present to his father, and he refused to do a broadside. To show his commitment, he came to the bridge of his ship to command his men directly. Hussein, meanwhile, took advantage of the situation. He ordered more archers to come to the top deck and intensified the hail of arrows. One arrow would graze Lourenço, while another hit him directly in the lower face. Blood gushed from his wounds as he fell to his knees. In pain, the young Almeida ordered the anchor line to be cut. The São Miguel and the São Antonio thus drifted away downstream. Now on the other side of the line, the Portuguese fleet was doing considerably better. 2 galleys and a small caravel rammed into the Mamluk ships. Their crews, protected by chainmail armor and steel breastplates, rushed over and boarded the anchored ships. The onslaught was fierce. They brought down the Muslim defenders with ease, and the oarsmen who were chained to their posts were rapidly cut down like grass. Men that attempted to run away were gunned down, and men that attempted to dive overboard were harpooned. The Portuguese then used the gangplanks to proceed from one ship to the next. At this point, it wasn't so much a battle, but a massacre. During the onslaught, anchor lines were cut and 4 of the Mamluk ships were towed away. The São Miguel and the São Antonio, meanwhile, provided fire support as best they could as the enemy galleys were seized. Lourenço then wanted his men to come in for a second attack. Again, he rejected the idea of bombardment. However, his men were exhausted and now the situation had taken a turn for the worse. Malik Ayaz had finally decided to join the fight on the side of the Mamluks. His ships entered the river and took up position on the southern bank. The Portuguese were now nearly surrounded and opted to abandon any further attack. Their tactical situation had now become critical. It was that night that Lourenço, still recovering from his wounds, decided along with his men to depart the city of Chaul. He did, after all, have his prizes of war, and the protection of the Cochin merchant ships was their first priority. At midnight, the ships of Cochin silently cut their anchor lines and began to leave, at which point the Portuguese started to follow them. Lourenço insisted that he and his ship, the São Miguel, would be the last to go, but by now, Amir Hussein and Malik Ayaz had figured out that their adversary was fleeing. Their fleets sprung into action. The Portuguese ships, knowing that they had been discovered, opened up with their cannons. They managed to keep the Mamluks at a distance with their gunfire. However, the São Miguel, which was towing another ship, began to drag behind. Lourenço, who had brought up the rear, was soon isolated. Malik Ayaz moved in quickly with his ships. When he was in firing range, he ordered them to target the São Miguel. His cannons were smaller, but one lucky shot hit the São Miguel, gouging a hole near the waterline. The bottom deck of Lourenço's ship thus began flooding. Men attempted frantically to pump out the water, but the São Miguel was carrying rice in its hold, which absorbed the incoming water like a sponge. The added weight slowed down the ship and eventually brought her to a standstill. In time, the São Miguel even began to list to one side. Now, while the Mamluks and the forces of DU were closing in for the kill, Lourenço's men were preparing a longboat for him to escape, but he would decline it. As water continued to seep in, the São Miguel was boarded. In the book, The Conquerors, the scene is told, quote, "It was mayhem aboard the São Miguel. Cannonballs were smacking into the immobilized vessel. Clouds of arrows buzzed and whined through the air. Thick gun smoke obscured the increasingly defenseless ship. The defenders beat off the first and second attempt aboard. They fought like men who wanted revenge before they died. But the ship was being destroyed around them. The deck was a shambles, littered with dead and dying men. Dismembered heads and legs, blood running down the planks. And everywhere there was shouting and screaming." End quote. Despite the chaos that surrounded him, Lourenço continued to command his men. But then, suddenly, a cannonball hit him directly in the thigh, cutting his leg completely off. His men raced to his side and lowered him into a chair. There, he would begin to bleed profusely onto the deck. His suffering, however, would not be for long. Another cannonball hit him in the chest, and this one would kill him instantly. Fighting aboard the São Miguel would continue for hours. The men of Portugal fought tenaciously, and a third, fourth, and fifth wave were beaten off. Indeed, a man from Porto who climbed into the crow's nest held his position there for 2 days, till he was granted amnesty to leave. When the bloodshed had ended, some of the Portuguese men were taken as prisoners. Others were executed. However, before the end, Lourenço's men took his body, and fearing that it would become a trophy for the enemy, pushed it from an opening where the weight of his armor sank it to the bottom of the Kundalika River. His remains would never be recovered. Amir Hussein and his allies had won the Battle of Chaul, but his victory was Pyrrhic as it came at a staggering cost in terms of men and ships. He had lost nearly 800 men from a crew of 1,400, and he was so weakened that he could not push on to attack the Portuguese stronghold at Cochin. News of the Portuguese defeat and the death of Lourenço was celebrated as far as Cairo, but Amir Hussein and Malik Aiz had no idea what they had just unleashed. When Francisco de Almeida received word of the death of his only son, he went into a state of profound grieving, as the Spanish would say, a tristeza profunda. For 3 whole days, he saw no one. Francisco was a man who had given everything for his country, and now that included his only son. He was a man that was consumed by a sense of duty. But when he emerged from his time in mourning, the only thing he had left in his soul was a profound sense of vengeance.